All right, are we live? I think we are live. Welcome. Sonia, it's great to see you.
It's good to see you, Andy. Always.
I want to
Always.
thank everyone for joining us today. For those of you who are new to Bellwether, we're a national nonprofit that works with a range of organizations, school districts, state education departments, charter school networks, policy advocates, nonprofits, private sector entities, and others to help them solve challenges and create better educational experiences for young people. If you go to our website, bellwether.org, you can see the kinds of out-facing and field-facing published reports and resources that we publish. We also host conversations like this to help people make sense of the most pressing challenges and what's going on in the sector. We're very excited that today's webinar we're doing in partnership with the 74, which is a fantastic education media outlet. I'm a biased, I'm on the board, but it really is fantastic. You should check out the range of work they do. A few housekeeping notes. If you're watching this later, you will not be able to ask questions. But if you're watching it live, you can ask questions using the chat or question box below. We'll be keeping an eye on those. We'll leave time at the end, so please chime in there. If you need to leave early or you want to come back and watch it again, the video will be posted. You're going to see it also on the 74 and some follow-on things there. But you'll be able to go back and watch it in whole or in part later at your leisure. And sign up for our newsletter. We host a lot of conversations like this in different platforms. I'm going to ask our producer Mackenzie to put the Bellwether newsletter sign up in the chat so you can do that. I am super excited to have Sonia here with us today for so many reasons. And I mean, and again, like just to get all the bias on the table, she's a friend as well as a colleague, just a fantastic person in the sector. Um, Sonia, we'll get to your full bio as we go through the conversation. But I want to start with I was poking around, and it seems like you were the longest serving superintendent in Baltimore City Schools since 1946. 10 years as an urban superintendent is a lot in any context. How did you do it?
Oh, so first I will say it's an honor to have served for 10 years. Baltimore is a great city. It's been very good to both me and my family. And I do think that matters, right? Like it matters that I feel a connection to the city. My children are Baltimoreans, despite Andy, what we might think about New England roots. They do root for Baltimore teams, not the teams you and I root for.
The
But
Orioles Army, they're not making it easy for you so far.
no, they're not. They're not. They're not at all. But I think a lot of it has to do first with having an amazing team. And I'm not just saying that to say that. I'm saying it because there's no way that one single individual, particularly in an urban setting, can manage all that comes with leading a major urban school district where you actually want to see change. And so having a fabulous team just at the senior level has been wonderful. And we've had a lot of stability on that team. Second, which you know intimately well as a former board member, my school board has been, I would say, for the overwhelming majority of the time, has been very focused, very supportive. It doesn't mean they agreed with me on everything. It doesn't mean we didn't have some internal factions. And I'd say with one major exception, really have had a decade of stability and focus, and for the most part, real strong board leadership has really helped. And you can be, as gifted an educator as any one individual could be. If you don't have a team around you and you don't have nine bosses who see what the larger picture is, you're not going to last. I don't care who you might be as an individual.
But nine bosses. That's a lot. That's like eight
A
more than
lot.
most people want, right? So it's like there's a lot of politics there. And like I'm not giving away any state secrets by saying you were in the running for Secretary of Education in 2020. A lot of people hoped you would get that post, myself included, as Biden was coming in. And the unions, you were not their favorite, and yet which I think says more about them than it says about you, because you made it 10 years. You were able to work with a union in Baltimore, and you were able to work with nine bosses. And this is also through the pandemic, so very sort of disruptive time. So like you obviously have some depth, a strong team you credited, but you obviously have just some deft skills and ability to navigate some complicated issues.
Yeah, and what's so funny about it, Andy, is one of the things that someone said to me, whom I still have great respect for. Well, we're not sure you're going to be able to do this job as CEO because we're not sure you have like the political acumen to be able to do it. And I now laugh at that because a lot of what people call political acumen I really believe is grounded in relationships and being forthright and knowing where people stand. And even when you don't fully know where they stand, you develop a cadence of um, transparency, of, telling the real deal. And when you build that around excellence, I do think that that helps. And the former president of the union, Marietta English, and Loretta Johnson, who I actually gave an award a couple of months ago. We would banter like all the time publicly, negotiations would be crazy. But I will tell you, and she won't mind me telling you this, she was very active in National Union for a long time, was right next to Randy and the whole 10 yards. But I knew with Loretta, I knew with Dr. Johnson when we closed the door and we had conversations, she cared about the communities of Baltimore. And she was actually the one, and I'm not afraid to say this, she was the one, and she wasn't even in the role anymore that I called during the pandemic. And I said, Loretta, what is it going to take to get people back to schools? And I need you to tell me, our current president was new at the time, so was no disrespect to her, but I knew Loretta had the capital and the knowledge. And again, ultimately, because she believed that kids needed to be back in schools, it was real problem solving with her. And she did that behind the scenes. The same thing happened, by the way, with a former Republican senator, which, in Maryland politics, you might say, why were you talking to that person, Sonja? But, Frank Kelly Sr. was amazing and he knew kids needed to be back. And so, again, behind the scenes, the people that you can call when you put down the artificial, but real, distinguishing, characteristics that might seem lightning rod, like, former union president, former Republican senator, those, borders go down and you actually start an interest-based conversation and you're straight with people and people know you as an ethical player, you can get things done. But like those are names I've never said when people say, how did you make it through the pandemic? Those, because those are people nobody would believe. But Loretta was the one who said to me, these are the things you got to do, and teachers will go back for you. And it was Frank Kelly who said, these are the kinds of things that you need to do in terms of setting up, the case making for going back. And then we had people here, Senator Cory McCray, Democrat leader. A lot of Democratic leaders did not want to stand to go back to school. And Cory McCray, who has 3 kids, I think 4 total maybe, who were in our system. And he said, I see at home that we've got to go back. And he was one of the people who stood up with me. And people don't know about those coalitions that are very much interest based. And I think that's part of what's made it work.
Let's I want to back out in a minute and get a little bit more of your backstory and some other things. But since we're on it, let's just one more question on the pandemic. I mean, that was such a formative experience for so many people in so many different ways, and in many ways broke trust with public education in a lot of places. And I think we're still feeling the effects of a lot of that. But what did you learn from that experience leading through that 2020 with the actual, the actual pandemic itself and people trying to figure out what was going on with this new virus and how to respond to it. And then 2021 with schools and then the learning loss after that. Talk about that. Like what did you learn from that experience?
Wow, I don't want to take the whole time to think about everything that I've learned because we could just stay on that. So I learned on the positive side that when you make an appeal for what is good for children, there will be people who respond. And so those teachers who in the early days in that fall, and you remember, Andy, Maryland was one of the last states to open. I mean, we felt like we wouldn't open for 5 years at one point. And we had
And then Virginia
courageous.
said, "Hold our beer."
That's right. That's exactly right. This is why I always love talking with you. Um, but yes, that's exactly right. And so, but we had people who understood that, for instance, we had families who had to go to work, who were first responders. And so those first teachers who went back when nobody knew what going back meant, right? Those are the people who understood. And I learned that there's always people who, when you model the courage, they will step up as well. And that was a fabulous learning. I also learned, and it cemented my belief, as controversial as it might be, we are expecting schools to do too much. Um, my sister is my balance, and she always says, "Well, Sonja, people didn't know at the time, and it was really scary." And I said, "Yeah, but like we knew the kids needed to be in school." And I think in places it just wasn't important enough, Andy. I know we say it was fear. Look, we have multi-generational families for in many of our students' homes. The poverty rates in Baltimore City, the concentrated poverty rates in Baltimore City. But I don't think we tried hard enough. I think we thought school was a nice to have and not a must have. And that was an unfortunate learning. And then the third is don't assume title equals courage. The fact that, and I'm still burned about it, that we were asking public school educators and leaders to make health decisions because our health leaders would not lead, quite frankly, is still a burr in my saddle. The fact that people are like, "Oh, well, you can open if you want to." And I'm sitting here looking like I mean, I consider myself decently smart, but Andy, I don't have a health degree. I don't know about communicable disease. I know far more now, by the way, than I did then about these things. And so, this idea that schools are supposed to be all things to all people, including, housing authority, we're supposed to find housing for kids, we're supposed to feed kids. And I think that we've got to take a step back and really say what is reasonable for schools to do. And I know that schools should do a lot of these things, particular or should be at least the hubs for these things when you serve large numbers of students in poverty. But that's my other learning, that I just stepped back and I said, "Oh, okay, just because you have the title, that doesn't mean you're actually going to wade in and make a hard decision. You're going to pass the hard decision to me because you don't want to make the hard decision." And that's kind of the flip side. I learned a lot that was great, but I also learned a lot that was, could have made me very, bitter if I wanted it to. It didn't, but yeah, it was amazing to see how people moved and who was willing to lead and who was not.
Yeah, two big ahas that kind of from that. One was parents. If people said the schools were safe to open, their views, if you polled parents, their views on change on opening schools would change. They trusted public authorities that if schools were closed, there must be a good reason, and if they were open, that it would be safe. So they were shifting responsibility back onto people who didn't always around the country live up to that responsibility. And then the health community. Yeah, I mean, there's David Zweig has this book called Abundance of Caution that really just traces step by step how political it got, particularly once Donald Trump said, he was still president in 2020 in his first term, said we should reopen the schools. Suddenly the politics of that changed really rapidly and it became a political flashpoint rather than like, you know, what he was saying was actually, fairly obvious. We did need to get schools open and we're paying a price. Let's talk about your backstory. So you mentioned Massachusetts. So you grew up Peabody,
Yeah,
am I right?
yeah, very
Yeah.
good. Yeah, good.
But your parents are from the South. They're from the pre-Civil Rights Act South. Um,
Yes.
so talk about sort of your upbringing. You worked in the Boston schools early in your career as well. So talk a little bit about your backstory and then what got you to Baltimore.
Yeah, so backstory is my parents were part of a wave of Black professionals who were being recruited in the 60s to come to the Boston area and north of Boston. My mom was a social worker, which was a big deal coming from, Jim Crow, uh, Georgia. And my dad was a chemist, or got a job as a chemist. It's interesting. It says a lot about our content now. He got a job as a chemist because he had enough chemistry credits, but actually was a biochem major, which was interesting, a biology major first. But he was recruited to be one of like the first wave of black black folks to try to integrate companies like Kodak and others, Eastman Gelatin. So they were on the North Shore. They lived through the integration of housing, which was painful for them. And there's stories written that we have up in our house. So they were some of the first Black families on the North Shore. And I grew up in the north of Boston suburbs. So when all of the busing was happening, I was in it, but not really in it. Like I remember my grandfather calling my mother when some of the pictures of the protests against busing in Boston occurred, and he thought that I was in danger, and my mom was trying to let him know, well, actually, she's not in that because we're north of the city, but it was very much part of my growing up. My parents were with Muriel and Otto Snowden, for those Bostonians who know, who founded Freedom House. They, my dad was very active in the NAACP, kind of all of those legacy organizations. And grew up in a home that was very clear the importance of education. My dad was very proud that growing up in rural Mississippi, he was one of the only Black families that got the regular newspaper, and they all had to read the newspaper every week. My mom was, my grandfather drove the bus, the one yellow school bus for Black students in the rural area they grew up, probably, I think, 50 miles west of Macon. And I played on that bus in summers, but didn't realize the significance of it until much later. And so, one of the things I like to say, and I've said over the years, is that I didn't realize Black people weren't supposed to be smart until like I got further along in high school and maybe college, that because all the Black people I knew growing up, even in a majority white neighborhood, were all really smart. And at that time, there was a wave of Black professionals coming to the North Shore. And so we were a small collection. But, I went to school with like Wayne Budd and his daughter, who went on to be, one of the first Black female, you know, the Supreme Court at the Massachusetts level, right? I grew up with people who went on to work in banking in Europe and those things, and came from humble means. Like we weren't part of a, Black rich whatever, but we were just part of a community of Black families who saw education as the way out. So for me, there was this belief that, like, why is Black academic performance somehow in question? Like I just didn't get it for a long time, and it's driven a lot of my work here. Before then, I thought I was going to be Condi Rice when I grew up. I was all set to do international even now I love listening to Condoleezza Rice. Like she was talking about the whole Russia Ukraine thing the other day, and my husband was like, "What are you listening to?" And I was like, "Shh, listening to Condi Rice talk about, XYZ," because I was going to be her, but fell in love with education. And, I have been very focused and driven by that. And it's why, and you know this, Andy, it's why I believe a lot of the things I believe about what education should look like for all kids, whether, whether it's immigrant children, whether it's first gen, whether it's poor white kids in West Virginia, or frankly, nowadays in Northern UK, like whoever it is, that upbringing for me was absolutely. And so it's also, lends to my intolerance of the anti kind of, the low level of expectations that we've talked about in education for a long time. But yeah,
So this
And
was
the
really, I
daughter of
mean,
the
I don't
debater.
want to put words in your mouth. And by the way, you referenced north of Boston a few times, which is a fantastic, subtle Boston, New England call out. Uh, it sounds like though this was like this became like your North Star just because of what you were steeped in this idea of achievement and excellence for all kids, regardless of their background or what they look like. Is that like?
Oh, without a doubt.
And that became that just sort of steeped you and became like a North Star, which tying back to our earlier conversation, like I think you have almost a unique ratio of you are you're able to navigate politically, you're able to do those things, but you also have an extremely high, in my view, sort of intolerant. You don't suffer fools, intolerance for sort of the nonsense of our sector, but you balance that with a deft touch, which may explain why we're having a 10-year exit interview. So talk about when you arrived in Baltimore a little bit. What were the big pressing issues? I want to talk about reading and math and absenteeism, but first just start with when you arrived in 2016, what was the scene? What were the big priorities that you saw?
Yeah, so I was actually entering back into the district, having worked at Education Trust. Shout out to my folks there for
They're
3 years.
about to celebrate a big anniversary.
Yes, they are. Yes, and Denise, if you're watching, yes, I did get my RSVP, so I'm good to go. But left. I was chief academic officer for 3 years, went to work for Ed Trust, and then it was really like coming back. And when I came back, the city was still reeling from the response to Freddie Gray, right? So that was there, which is why when the country went through its convulsions, a couple of years after that, Baltimore City was like, yeah, we've done this, right, recently. And so the country, I mean, the
And Freddie
city,
Gray, I think most people know, but it's
oh,
been
sorry.
a few years. So he was a young man who
Yeah,
was killed by police in
police.
Baltimore.
That's right. And a lot of the uprising in response to that, led to the kind of conflict, we've come to know in a lot of these situations. And so the city was still doing a lot of reflection. And so I entered during that time of this combination of, this horrible incident then leads to discussions about that what in the history of Baltimore has changed or not changed. So that was there. There was also instability, which was interesting because, my former boss, Andres Alonso, had been CEO for 6 years. There was this feeling of when I left, of transition. But then the intermittent years from the time Andres left to when I was asked to come back, there was a feeling of instability, lack of direction. It doesn't mean nothing good happened in those years. I actually think some of the arts work that we continued, what happened during that time, and but there really was that sense. It was also the autonomy because of the push for site-based autonomy at that time. Site-based autonomy combined with unstable district leadership and lack of direction feels like chaos to a regular classroom teacher, right? So, what is it I'm supposed to be doing? And so, there was a real, when I talked to teachers at that time, they may say something different now, but at that time, they were just like which curriculum am I supposed to be following? What's optional? What's not? And that led to the work that we did very early that's now called, quality instructional materials and PD and the focus on literacy. That came as part of the entry. And so we started that work before kind of they became national focal points. But a lot of it was because people were asking for that. And then just putting structures back in place. And this is the piece that's, I think, frightening to me that I will be honest, Andy, I did not believe when I left the district 3 years prior that things like systems of getting folks paid, right? Financial projection, legal cases, although the legal piece was okay, generally speaking, but just the infrastructure, right? Like human capital, those systems like soak up your time and then to walk into right $40 million or 30 to 40 million right budget deficit in October and you've just come on board July 1 and you're like, okay, this can't be true. Why is this gap here? And then a year later, and you'll chuckle at this, I had said to my chief of staff when we were going through areas in those first 3 months, I said, well, we can put operations off for a bit. I think that's going fairly well. And then, oh, 80 schools in Baltimore go down without heat. They're the pictures seen around the globe. Like literally, I had cousins who were deployed in places like Germany who were sending me emails like, what's going on with your heat? Right. And they're in Germany and I was like, how are you hearing this in Germany? This is crazy. Or like, my auntie in rural Georgia, girl, what happened up there to your heat? You can't heat the kids. So, you know, so I immediately had to actually lean into finances and operations as an academic, right? So all those people who are like, well, we know she can do academics, but can she do the other stuff? Immediately that was squelched, Andy. Like people were like, oh, I guess she can, right? But it's that infrastructure piece that we take for granted, and it's the behind the scenes piece that the public rightly should assume is going well, but it's not, right? It's not going well. And so you've got to piece that together. I tell the
And was
story.
that the normal sort of, I shouldn't say normal, we've normalized the deferred maintenance, or was this just in previous inattention? What
Great
was
question.
what like yeah, like what, because it sounds like you were inheriting a lot of stuff that was sort of
Yeah.
adrift.
Yes, I would say on the operations front, it was the convergence of multiple things. It was deferred maintenance, but it was deferred maintenance also because of a long-term underinvestment. And the state said that. That was not us. The state came out with a report that said Baltimore City has been shorted 360 to 380 million a year, right? For the past, I don't know, 8 to 10 years, and it's led to, right, this
Right.
state of horrible buildings. And on top of that, very forthrightly, we also did not have systems and processes in place that needed to be there because the shift in resources to the classroom, which is a good thing, right? There's nothing wrong with that, meant that we had borrowed or taken from operations. And so we had to build those systems back in. I tell a funny story that's not really funny. When we realized we couldn't tell centrally what the temperatures were in all of the buildings, and I charged, this person no longer works with us. I had I had asked the chief operating officer. I said, we've got to get some way of reading the temp now before we get a full system. And Andy, they came back with a meat thermometer. And I went, a meat thermometer? We're just going to get a meat thermometer for every classroom in the district. Needless to say, that person doesn't work here anymore. But like that's the state of where the systems
Yeah, yeah.
were. It's like we're using meat thermometers to tell temps.
Was it even a digital one, or was it one of the really old? Like,
It
was it?
was a digital, though.
Okay.
I think you should feel good to know it was digital. But being a cook, I was like, I don't know HVAC as well. I know HVAC much more now. I was like, but I do know what that's used for, and it's not for room temperature.
All right, so you come in, if I have this right, reading scores in Baltimore are up 12 points over your tenure, which is faster than they've been growing in the state. So you talked about the high quality. You were sort of an early adopter of and proponent of curriculum given your academic background. So talk about that piece, then we'll come back, we'll talk about math separately. So literacy, what worked? How did you get those gains?
Yeah, so I think what worked was not just the high quality instructional materials, which a lot of people, including but it was the shifts of one focus around literacy and the alignment of systems around that focus on literacy. And that took longer than I would have wanted it to take, but I will happily say I know that we learned from that. We got a new chief academic officer 6 years ago, Joan Dabrowski, who is amazing. And I will tell you, if you look at the impact of our secondary literacy, rollout of HQIM and um, the support we learned from the early. And so if you look at our gains last year, we we had the highest single year gains in literacy since I've been in Baltimore, and that includes as chief academic officer. So like that's almost the last 20 years. And a lot of it was we learned from what went well with elementary literacy and what didn't go so well. And my mantra has always been it's about growth, but it's also about how to accelerate growth. So, the first year you take 1 or 2%, the state's stagnant or declines. And so you celebrate it, but you haven't, that's not where the lift is. But each year, what started happening, and this is where the pandemic messed a lot of folks up, including us, I think, in math, but the systems we had in place were leading us to the point that the growth was increasing every year. And so even some of the thoughtful critics of the work in Baltimore City had to say, yes, that's true, right? You are increasing the rate. And so the hope is that now we can do that in other areas with the new leadership. Math was harder, frankly, because we had a lot of focus on literacy for a while, had to bring math on board, all of the challenges everyone everywhere has in math. But what exacerbated it was that our students took a bigger hit because they had less protective tissue. But like I can tell you, and I've told this story, my nephew is an engineering student at Cornell. And the Cornell folks will tell you that the pandemic year babies in math, their kites in the kite festival didn't look as advanced, even in Cornell, as they had the years before. So, up and down, what we're now talking about math, and Maryland is low in math. So even
Right. Yeah, but double click on that. I mean, why is that
yeah.
proven so stubborn?
So I do think we need to have a science of math moment, the way we've had a science of reading moment. There is too much negotiation. There's not enough clarity. So that is one. That's more recent. Two, we have never really fully grappled with the lack of math knowledge and support of math teachers in the lower grades. And that's true across the board. That in those early years, we don't we still have not figured out how to, at scale, really raise that level. I think the UK has done some fabulous work in this. And we really need to look because the UK story in math is a fabulous story in terms of where London and other
Yeah.
jurisdictions were and where they are now. And again, it's what a lot of people are writing about now in my Substack, Andy. It's not sexy. And so when we pulled away the sexy things, like people want there to be, one form of software that's going to do it all, right? Or we get this one piece of math curriculum and that's going to solve it. But in the UK, they were systematic, unapologetic. It doesn't look sexy. And they did it, and the outcomes, no one can argue with those outcomes. And I will tell you, being, visiting some of those classrooms with folks from the United States where we want everything to be engaging and kids to just be laughing as they do
Yeah,
math,
yeah.
they're not tripping over that in UK. And their students of color are outperforming large numbers of other students, particularly in their urban centers, because they went deep on those foundational pieces, and we still leave things up to negotiation.
And Nick Gibb has written, who was the minister, led a lot of that work, has written a book about it. He's out and about. And so that's something if people are interested in, they can go deeper on. Talk about chronic absenteeism. Obviously, the pandemic exacerbated that, but like getting kids into school is always a challenge. And so talk about what's worked and the work that still remains to be done there.
Yeah, and there's a lot of work that still remains to be done. And I've said this to Dr. Dawson, who's the incoming CEO. Like
And we can pause
that's
on that. So he's coming out of
oh, sorry.
Philadelphia, coming down, and he'll be taking over this summer.
Yes, yes. We've already had great meetings, great conversation. But I have been very forthright with him. The board has been forthright. We've reduced our chronic absentee rate by 12 percentage points since the pandemic, but it's still way too high. And we really have to focus on that. So one thing is actually focus. And once we started focusing, we saw that. I do think, and you know, Andy, people um, talk about the trust that's been broken with families around education. We also broke the trust of young people. And so the reason to come to school, I don't think is clear anymore. And so there's a number of factors. One, for districts like ours, you know, we have kids and families in crisis. But I would say more so, it really is what does a community-wide effort look like around chronic absenteeism? And how do we absolutely have the schools, you know, not abdicating responsibility, we won't. But what is very clear is the places where we've seen the lift are places where we have partnered with community leaders and organizations. And I don't mean frankly, some of the most formal or well-resourced ones. I mean, people who will hit the ground. They know where kids are. They build relationships. And we've got to have schools. We know the chronic absentee rates decline significantly in the schools where young people feel like they have at least one, if not more than
Good
one,
reason. Yeah.
adult who's going to notice when they're not there. And so we have, I think, a cluster of challenges around this area. Again, I think we've taken the first full swipe at it, but there's a lot deeper work that needs to be done around the relevance. And I will tell you, a lot of our investment in expanding our career track is in response to young people who said that will get me back, right? I know that I have a place where I can do something that isn't necessarily college immediately after, right? It is actually I want to know if I can work now. And in some cases, young people are using it to pay their way through college. But in others, you know, Baltimore City has a very rich industrial blue collar history, and our community does not want to let that go. So it's our responsibility to make sure we update that and equip kids. But it is, you know, kids were voting with their feet, and we have to compel, but we also have to have a community-wide expectation that young people are in schools. And I don't think we still have that. We say we do, but I don't think that we do. Not at
Well,
the
it's
way.
hard that when we during the pandemic we decided to reopen bars and restaurants, we didn't open schools, and that sent a message that I think people actually heard then
I
and
agree.
responded to around the priority on this. The other thing with this career bringing them back with that is also how do you make sure in a place like Baltimore that doesn't become tracking and does it that doesn't like the kids still can pursue where you have choice and agency and the ability to pursue whatever dreams or passions they have.
No, and you're absolutely right. And I think part of what we've done with that is one, to ensure that we're clear that the baseline to enter trades or any area that's going to yield a family sustaining income are frankly just as rigorous. So you don't get to bottom out on the state math test and then say, oh, I think I'll go be a plumber, because actually that's not true anymore.
Right,
You
there's
actually
math.
need
Yeah,
more.
plumbers, there's math. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so that is part of it. And I think that's why the efforts to really raise the floor across the district have been important. And then a lot of our equity work around taking some hard looks in the mirror over the last 10 years, Andy, and saying, where is the access to the higher level learning opportunities located, and being honest about the reproduction of, you know, economic instability and low income generation that have persisted and are still along certain geographic lines, and really asking the questions about how we interrupt that. So
You had an equity plan when you came in.
Mhm.
Talk about, I have a couple more questions and I want to bring in the questions from the audience. One of
Please.
them is like talk about like progress against that equity plan.
Yes. So one of the things that we started was we did go back to the history of Baltimore City of redlining and mapped that to where educational opportunity is currently. So whether it's access to advanced math classes, if it is access to early music instruction, like wherever that was, where were we and where did we fall short? And so we used in the early years this equity index to guide our decisions about where investments needed to be made, not just money, but programmatic, high quality teaching. Where were the teachers going? Where were they? And so those were the first couple of years. And then we actually brought on Dr. Tracy Durant to say, how do we then infuse some of those principles into our everyday work? And that equity work, I think, has led to a definition, at least in our district, that goes beyond, we've done some of the workshops, but it goes beyond workshops. And our equity team, which is, sometimes a point of consternation for them, they have a return on investment analysis as well. It's not just do people feel good when they come out of your workshop. It's okay, if we're going to do an equity analysis, do we have more little black boys in advanced math because of what we've done? Because if it's only about filling out a survey about how people feel, I got to tell you, and I'm old, Andy, you can do that someplace else. Like
You're
I
not
don't really
you're
have
not
time
that
for
old, but you've talked about this. You and on some other public events you and I have done, you've talked about how like I think equity is one of these words that now means, a thousand things to a thousand people, but like the way you're talking about it, it's making sure kids have what they need to succeed. It's not about lowering standards. It's not about
That's right.
limiting opportunities. It's and I feel like that sort of framework, that's an important framework given the work that we're ostensibly engaged
Absolutely.
in. Talk about the money there, and generally, you talked earlier about a funding shortfall that Baltimore, and Baltimore, there's the constant. You're the big city in the state fighting with the state over resources. That's a story that plays out in different states in different ways. Um, so talk about the resource situation and talk about in terms of this equity work. There's some concern that if you pile the money on specific schools, it can end up working at cross purposes with efforts around integration and things like that. So talk about sort of how you navigated getting Baltimore as much money as you could from the state to for what it needed, and then how the actual allocations of that money inside the city and avoiding perverse consequences.
Yes, and I think we're now learning more about what some of those perverse consequences could be. For for the first phase, though, a lot of it was centered around active advocacy around, the Maryland State school funding formula, which was, and you know this, by many accounts actually regressive. Like, Ed Trust has or had a scale where they would analyze state school funding formulas, and Maryland's was actually regressive. And so the institution of the blueprint, right, the proposed blueprint for Maryland schools really flipped that on its head, as you know, and gave more money connected to places where there was concentrated poverty. There are very specific ways you can use that. It's not a blanket, we just give you more money. It has to go to pre-K, it has to go, to certain functions like community school coordinators in schools that serve large numbers of students from concentrated poverty, but it flipped the idea of where the resources go. I do think the growing pains, and I want to say growing pains, we shouldn't be ripping it out at its roots, but the growing pains is exactly what you just said. And it's what, Thomas Sowell always says, right? That policy has trade-offs. And so we're now living through that trade-off in this, even in the poorest district in the state with the highest percentage of concentrated poverty. I'll have one school down the street that is getting $3 million, right? And it's increase for one school, and one down the street that's actually getting less. Now, by design, the funding formula is supposed to and does give money based on the demographics, background of the young people and their need. But it is fuzzier. in reality. And one of the things that all of my colleagues, even superintendents in wealthier parts of Maryland, will agree is that we are going to have to take a look at what the base amount is, because I would argue, and we benefit, this is why we've been able to increase arts and sports and everything else in Baltimore City schools. But what is true is if that base is too low for schools that aren't serving large numbers of other students in need, there will be a backlash. There absolutely will be. And we will suffer because people will say, oh, it didn't work, and go away. And so we've been advocating that that base amount needs to be increased in order to make it viable for my colleagues across Maryland. But it is a challenge. But I give all the credit to the Maryland legislature for being willing to take a real about face in the funding formula, but it's not done yet. And the margins are still small. I said to a local reporter, running an urban school district and I was determined that over the course of 10 years, we were not going to be in the paper every day. We were going to resolve this. We were going to, it meant cuts in a lot of places, which were hard, but we have maintained a fiscal conservatism that I think has benefited the city and the state in showing that we can use money well. And all of our federal dollars, there, you didn't hear crazy stories about people building swimming pools or anything else. Our folks in our finance office were dogged about making sure we spent it well, but the margins are thin. And all it takes is giving in to political favoritism. Because, I made a lot of people mad over the years, Andy. I said, no, we're actually not taking your contract. And no, you do have to bid for this. And no, we're not going to not do the cuts because seven of the people who got the notices. And a lot of times, and this is true everywhere, those favors nip at very small margins. And I compare it to jackals. You can look up the characteristics of a jackal on your own, but the jackals are there and they are ready to be fed. So someone is going to have to tell them no.
So there's a question in the chat I want to start with from Susan Moore Johnson. Sort of anticipates what
Oh,
my last question was
Susan.
going to be, so I'm going to kind of combine them. Yeah, it's great to
Yeah.
see Susan here. She wants to know the state of play around school autonomy and sort of centralization, decentralization. I'd ask you to talk about that, and then from that, also talk about what's the role of choice in a place like Baltimore, Maryland has a tortured history with charter schools, but how do you see what's the role of choice in a place like Baltimore going forward?
Yeah, there's actually been a lot of pressure to get rid of choice. And I still believe, which is why we have not gotten rid of choice, that when you are serving the communities of people that we are, and this is where me and my national charter folks absolutely have agreement, you have to provide choice for those families. And to say you are relegated to a school that no one can guarantee. And we have more of them now. After 10 years, I'm very proud of the fact that we have more schools that more families choose. But I believe you have to have choice or you're being hypocritical. And I have not changed on that. What we have found, though, is that choice with autonomy without direction and accountability is not great. And we have recalibrated autonomy. So, for example, the curriculum, right? When I came in as CAO, schools could pick whatever the heck they wanted, even if it was professional malpractice. And that we have stopped. Like, you don't get to do that anymore. Yeah, we're actually pulling back even more around that instructional core. You don't get to choose whether children have art. And some schools were choosing that. They would change the art, Andy, every year. So one year you'd have an instrumental music teacher. Oh, well, enough kids didn't like it. Let's switch to Chinese. And then they would switch again. And we serve children that cannot take the shifts of whimsical leaders who do that. And a lot of our principals were newer and asking for that. So we've tightened, but I would say there are those who would say we need to tighten even more. We've kept some of that autonomy, and Susan, it's a great question. Good to see you. But yeah, we've tightened a bit on that because I don't do choice of professional practice very well. We don't give surgeons choice on how they want to cut. So you don't get a choice, at least in the traditional schools, about how you teach reading. We're not doing that anymore. And it's shown up in the data.
So a couple more real quick questions.
Please.
Caitlin Sullivan, and I'd get in trouble because she's CEO of Leading Now. I'm on her board, working with superintendents, so I have to respond to her question. Um, she said, just what advice do you have? You talked about earlier in the conversation about relationship building. Just like real quick, like what advice do you have? What are some of the sort of things hidden in plain sight that not enough superintendents are doing around relationship building?
One, I think broadening the net of who you're meeting with, who you're talking to. My previous example during the pandemic of the actors that people would assume I would not relate to, I actually was. And I think sometimes we allow ourselves to get in those boxes. Second, in terms of relationship build, know what your core is and be consistent. The vacillation based on the moment and the situation does not play well for long-term relationships. And let's be clear, there are people who don't like me, and that's fine, but they know what I stand for. And I'm willing to still have conversations with people. And I think we've got to be open and not see a lot of new superintendents see everybody is coming for them. And you've got to suspend enough of that so that you can at least attempt to have some dialogue, even with people you might disagree with 90% of the time.
Yeah, I also found like people would get upset, like a public comment, people are yelling at you and stuff, and it's like, well, it's a free country, and that's the job. That's what you sign up for, and like you don't just get to engage with the people who want to like tell you how great you are. You got to also engage with the ones
That's
who want
right.
to tell you how wrong you are, and that's just like if you don't want to do that, like then you can't kind of sign up for the
Agreed.
job.
Agreed. Well said.
So we got a broad question, then I'm going to finish on a more narrow question for you. The broad question is from Paul Manna, Professor at
Hey,
William and Mary,
Paul.
yeah, known to his high school friends as Paulie. And Paul asks just his students, like, what do you see as the biggest looming K-12 challenges right now for the sector, like not just Baltimore specifically, but you're a national leader for the sector writ large?
So I think writ large, I would double click on two things. One, this issue of public confidence is not a pipe dream, and we have got to take it seriously. Whether you are in a sprawling suburban wealthy district or whether you are in Baltimore City or the South Side of Chicago, and we have to take it seriously and we have to build it back. That is connected to I do think this issue around what should school be and not following this AI boogeyman. Like that there are and I love AI. I think it's great. I don't like the water it takes. My kids give me, an earful every time somebody uses ChatGPT. But I will say this, I am worried about, and I've been very clear about this in a number of settings. I'm glad LA is going the way they are. We have got to take back responsibility for the things that we try, and this is for you, Paul, that don't work, and how we actually scale some of that back. And we don't do that well in education. We love to layer, but we don't like to say that didn't work. Maybe we need to throw that out. And we don't do that well, and people are coming for us if we don't. And I don't think we have full public trust in the same way, and we need to address that. We really do.
And I think it's great that Paul's whole class is watching this at William and Mary, which is
Oh,
great. So, what are you hopeful about? Like, so we talked about the challenges. Like, what makes you hopeful?
what makes me hopeful is we still have people who believe in the power of education to transform lives. I don't think I worried a few years ago prior to the pandemic that we had given up on all children deserving access to a high quality education. I was very worried about that. I'm not as worried anymore, partly probably because of students in Paul's class, other folks around, people that want to still be superintendents, God only knows why. But those things give me hope. I think some of the policy rubs, while people might have their pick, I do think people like you, Andy, and I'm not just saying this because I'm talking to you, who continue to stir the pot, right? Who continue to make the press. I don't think public education is doomed. I think that there are people who still believe in it, but we've got to recalibrate. And I am so thrilled about this generation. I think they're more innovative. I think the whole Gen Z thing is wild to me because I have Gen Zers at home. But I do think we've got creative young people, and I think that they have a voice. They know they have a voice. We just need to have to make sure that they're well trained, they have the tools they need, and they have the foundation that we know they're going to need.
Okay, that's great. And you can tell your kids not to worry too much about the water. That's a little over.
It's it
It's a
overrated?
little
Okay.
overstated.
Well,
Last question's Monique Thompson. The same question I was going to ask you. What's next? I know a few things that are next for you. You and I are going to go watch the Red Sox play the Orioles in Baltimore, and you're going to come visit us down at UVA. But what else is next for you more generally? What's the next chapter for Sonja?
so I don't know. I'm going to make sure our two high school students that are home with my husband and I actually get out and find themselves a college with our help. So that's a big focus for me. I love the work at Broad. It's not, full time, but I literally had a call with them this
You're a
morning.
superintendent in residence at the Broad
Sorry.
Center at
Yes.
Yale. Yeah.
Yes. So I'm a superintendent in residence, and I love that. Love the fellows, love the faculty at the School of Management. I mean, shout out to Yale SOM because I've never met business-minded people who are so like warm and thoughtful about education. And so I'm loving that. And then I'm going to explore some things. I'm going to think about what's next. The possible ways of entry. And I'm going to take some time to write again, but not at least in a journal. So I'm not coming out with a book, so don't hold your breath on that one. But I am looking forward to kind of stepping back a little bit and having some reflection. But don't
Well,
know.
you've certainly earned that. I hope you do some writing publicly because you have a lot of important things to say. And I appreciate you coming and joining us today and saying some of those things. So thank you very much, everybody listening. And Sonia, really, thank you for 10 years on behalf of kids in Baltimore and families there. And thank you more generally for your leadership in the sector and specifically again for your time today. Thank you.
No, thank you. And thank you, Bellwether, for always keeping us honest and holding us accountable. I appreciate it.